Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whatever time of day it is, I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Winner Winner Chicken Dinner. Yeah. Okay, have fun, guys. Okay, all right, so this one begins because I was looking at the history of coronavirus, how we know about it, who named it, so on and so forth. Although while there's a lot of great information about COVID out there, and lots of channels talking about COVID, I really haven't seen much about the history of the coronavirus itself. That's not to say those videos aren't out there, I just haven't seen them. So for my own curiosity, I was kind of taking a look around the history of coronavirus, and I think I found something really fun, right? But before I can talk about that, I need to touch briefly on the work of Antoine Béchamp, right? And he was known mostly for his terrain theory of infection and illness. That the body builds up such a level of toxin, and then its natural defense is the creation of this virus, which tries to get rid of these toxins. And it's an unfortunate byproduct of this process that leaves us with the symptoms of cold, influenza, things like this. And those symptoms can get so serious that it leads to death, unfortunately. His main concepts were to treat the body well, and the body will treat you well. Kind of common sense, right? And I love this picture of him because it reminds me of Keenan Wynn here, who played the grandfather in so many things in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? And here he's looking rather like Tommy Chong, but, maybe a little more stern here. But I thought the resemblance was kind of uncanny. But it's through this terrain theory, and this idea that viruses are our body's natural responses to this level of toxicity that could build up, which was the complete opposite sort of idea that Pasteur and so many other scientists of the time were trying to get out there, right? And there was a big rivalry between these two men, which I have here. I'm not going to go into it now, but I'll share this article so you can read about it yourself. It's a really great article. Essentially, Pasteur and his camp, the invisible enemy in germ theory and so forth, won, and Béchamp lost, right? He was buried in history. All right, but it's reading this, it's having an understanding of this terrain theory that makes this possible going forward, okay? All right, so I'm looking at the history, right? Let's get right to it because we all know all of this good stuff. All right, and it says here that the earliest reports of an illness caused by coronavirus occurred in the late 1920s, when an acute respiratory infection of domesticated chickens emerged in North America. And so this was discovered in 1931 by Arthur Schock and M.C. Hahn, all right, in North Dakota. All right, and the virus itself was later isolated in when? And then human coronaviruses were identified in the 1960s. And we're going to talk about David Tyrel here, who's the man who actually names the coronavirus, because he's the one who names the human coronavirus. And so here we go with David Tyrel here, right? And right away, I love his name, David, Arthur, John. Right? So we have King David, King Arthur, King John, or perhaps John the Baptist. All these sort of mythological alpha male names here, right? And right away, I notice that he's a member of the Royal Society. And right away, I notice that he's a fellow of the Royal Society. And we know what their agenda is and where their allegiances lie. They have to further the agenda of the crown, right? And I think it's interesting that he's the person who names coronavirus, right, as a member of the Royal Society. And so I want to look at his last name, Tyrel. It's an attention grabber for me, especially with Tyr right here up front, right? And so what the House of Names tells me is that it's an Anglo-Saxon name, right? And the name Tyrel was given to a member of the family who was stubborn or obstinate, right? And it's derived from the old French word tirer, right? Meaning to draw, one who pulls on the reins, like pulling back on a horse, I guess, that kind of thing, right? But I think it's interesting that it can have other meanings as well, because like I said, what draws me to the name is the word Tyr. And so Tyr, among other things, was this Anatolian sun god, and that's really interesting, or going to be really interesting going forward for things that lie ahead. But for here, I'm thinking more of this Norse deity here, who's more aligned with like Mars and Ares. Right? And there's a great story of him losing his hand in battle with a lion, him and the other gods, and the lion playing such a major role in royal heraldry. All right, but also so that's could be the Tyr part. But when I looked at it originally breaking down the name, I really only focused on the L part, and so that makes a little more sense with other versions of the, with other spellings, like T-I-R, and as they had it for the Old French with the T-I-R-E-R. I found this one. It's the fourth month of the Persian calendar, the fourth solar month of the Persian calendar. I think that's interesting, or can be interesting if they use this spelling originally, because there is some evidence that there was a Middle Eastern presence in England, So I think that could be kind of interesting, but also it has other meanings as well in the Celtic, which is probably closer to the point, where it meant dry or dry land. So Tyrel, with the L meaning of the, right? He could have been man of the dry land, which could have been Persia, kind of interestingly enough. But again, so just really interesting that Tyrel can be sort of translated in a bunch of different ways, depending on how you want it to look at it, right? And so just briefly with him, this is really interesting. He grew up in Sheffield, Miss Havisham, right? He studied at the University of Sheffield, and he did time as a house physician at the Sheffield hospitals before leaving in 1950 to work at the Rockefeller Institute under this Frank Horsfall. And so Frank Horsfall was this big-time virologist working at the Rockefeller Institute at the time as well, right? And so Tyrel works under him, right? And this is interesting too. I don't really know quite how this works, but Tyrel enrolls in the U.S. Army as a British citizen. I'm not sure how that works during the Korean War, but interesting. Rockefeller Institute, U.S. military, perhaps in an intelligence capacity, who knows? But after the Korean War, he goes back to Sheffield, right, where he works at the virus research laboratory there, before moving on to the Common Cold Unit near Salisbury, right? And so it's here, the Common Cold, in this June Alameda, take the first images of rubella virus, and it's here that they have the discovery and invention of coronavirus. I love that they use the word invention here. Yeah, and if you want to read about that, I'll try to remember to link this wiki page, but it's at the David Tyrel wiki page. So they get the name, of course, from these first images, right? And they see the halo around it, the spikes or whatever, and they look that up in Latin, halo, and Latin for halo is corona. I mean, that's the story that this David Tyrel tells, right? So I think all that's kind of interesting. At least connecting David Tyrel to the Royal Society and back his family name back to the Anglo-Saxons and so forth. I think that's kind of an interesting element of it. But really, as I was saying, I wanted to get into the history of it. How do we first know about coronavirus? And so the earliest reports of an illness caused by a coronavirus occurred in the late 1920s, when an acute respiratory infection of domesticated chickens emerged in North America. And so now this was first observed in 1931 by Arthur Schalk and M.C. Hahn in North Dakota. And so when I looked at that date and started thinking about Béchamp's terrain theory and how, viruses are a reaction to built-up toxins, and applying this idea to domesticating chickens, because when I see the phrase domesticated chickens here, I'm thinking large industrial chicken coops and feeding people on a large scale, and then the late 1920s. Now, if you want to tie this into like the population reset or the mass immigration movement of the mid and late 1800s, however you want to look at it, they were moving people into cities, grouping them together like they had never been before, right? And indoctrinating them to a new way of life, especially with all these exhibitions and new schools and things of that nature, right? And so thinking about how would you feed them? I kind of wish I went back and looked at the Meat City episode, because I'm sure some of that information would tie in here as well. But thinking about this time frame, maybe that could be right. And so I wanted to look at the history of the industrial chicken industry, right? So the National Chicken Council has this article here. And so what they say in the early 1800s is it's mostly homesteading. People would have their chicken coops, and it would be for eggs and the occasional chicken for Sunday maybe, or for a holiday feast, But that by the turn of the century, people started to sell chicken for their meat. People started to raise and sell chicken for their meat. Talking early 1900s here. And so now we're looking at like a 20 or 30 year process of putting these chickens into coops and creating the industrial chicken meat industry, right? The way that they did. And, and how long that could take to build up a toxicity level in the chickens to produce a virus that would be noticed in 1931 by Schock and Hahn. The industry itself really takes off in the 20s, so maybe even it happens a lot quicker when they first breed the broiler, which was a chicken especially bred for its meat, right? And that this practice was first really brought out in the Delmarva Peninsula, as well as in southern climates like Georgia and Arkansas, but also New England as well. But this woman here, William Steele, is often cited as the pioneer of the commercial broiler industry. In 1923, she started with 500 chicks, and within 3 years, she was able to grow her operation to 10,000 birds. But the thing about this that really got my alarms going was that she was in Sussex County, Delaware. And of course, immediately seeing Sussex, I can't help but be drawn to the idea of, the Sussex Declaration. Right? And that the Earls of Shaftesbury have connections to Sussex as well. And of course, we can't forget about the Dukes of Richmond as well, tied into Sussex. So, that immediately threw up flags for me, seeing that this took place in a place called Sussex County. All right, so I wanted to Google her, Miss Wilmer Steele. Right, so I did, and I found this article here about it says mistake kickstarts billion-dollar poultry industry. And what even gets the apophonetic connections running wild on this one even further is that her first name is Cecily, or the feminine for Cecilius, as in Cecil Calvert, Lord Baltimore, the second Lord Baltimore. All right, that, the coincidence there is absolutely astonishing, especially when we realize that this Sussex County on the Delmarva Peninsula, and I'm going to look at it real quick here, this unfortunately shaped mass of land is the Delmarva Peninsula, and it was highly disputed. It was at one time under control of the Calverts, but also the Penns, and Virginia had a stake in some of it as well, too. So it's interesting that this area of land, was so important to these early colonists and proprietors of land, Again, with the Calvert connection to this land and her name being Cecil or Cecily, again, the coincidences just are so crazy. So I wanted to see what else I could find out about Sussex County. And again, it talks about the property disputes and that, it was originally settled by the Dutch and the Swedish, but the English came along soon enough and it was easy for them to gain control of this area where, again, it was hotly contested. But in the end, it ended up in William Penn's hands, right? And he names it Sussex County because of his time in Sussex County. And so I found this article from the West Sussex Record Office about William Penn in West Sussex. Right? And so apparently he lived there for 30 years. And West Sussex was an early meeting place for the Society of Friends, or the Quakers. Right? And so now connecting the Quakers to Sussex, the Dukes of Richmond, who were allegedly friendly with the Patriot movement, right? The Shaftesbury were there, the Sussex Declaration, and now tying William Penn and this land where the chicken industry was born and connecting chickens to coronavirus is absolutely unbelievable. So it says here that most of Penn's connections with West Sussex are not generally well known, but his presence there had a life-changing impact on local people. So life-changing that his connections are not known, lived there for over 30 years. And again, it is established that areas in Sussex and around there were meeting houses for the early Society of Friends. And, he was held under house arrest there for a while as well, allegedly, depending on how much faith you want to put into that story. So absolutely crazy the way that this thing keeps pulling together around this region, right? And especially with Tyrel as well being this Anglo-Saxon name, right? And the history of the word Sussex comes from essentially South Essex, which is the southern Saxon territory, right? So, Sussex and Essex, Middlesex, they're all part of the Saxon territory. And so again, families could be related in this way, going back in the story as they tell it to us. Who knows how far back, right? So I thought that was really amazing tying it that way. So of course, thinking about that and, tying it back to the older Anglo-Saxon history and the crown, and heraldry, because the rooster is quite a common heraldic symbol. And so it turns out, I did some research, and of course, the rooster is known by its other name, the cockerel or the cock, cockerel being a young rooster, and going back and looking at the history of the rooster and its worship, there's so many jokes that could be made about the history of rooster worship and how it goes back thousands of years. But I wanted to take a look at some heraldic chickens, because it was, tying this whole thing back to, like I said, through the Royal Society and who knows how far back, right? And so I was, they talk about the elements of the rooster that make it so worthy of heraldry, and that it's an aggressive, arrogant animal, and that it's a fighter, and so it's warriors and knights were easily drawn to this to this animal as its symbol. It's a very prideful kind of animal. I like on this one, the comb, that fleshy part on top of a rooster is called a comb, really looks like a crown here. Again, furthering the coincidental, the non-coincidental, the apophonetic connections between the chicken and the coronavirus, where this type of virus was first noticed. Right? And this is the best one. This one really made the connections go crazy for me. It just blew my mind with this one. Right? And this is the Han coat of arms, right? And I really like it because not only to me is it very reminiscent of that double phoenix or double dragon one that is like ubiquitous almost with these old heraldic shields, coat of arms. I think it's even on the side of medieval times. But don't quote me on that one, or the double phoenix one, right? And I'm probably going to use this one as a title card for this episode. But when I saw the name Han, and in realizing what I had just read earlier about the history of the first noticed coronavirus, before they called it a coronavirus, noticed in 1931 by Schock and Hahn. And now Hahn is awfully close to Han, right? Awfully close. And so I don't know how much of a coincidence it could be that guy was studying chickens. Right? His name is Han, which is really close to Han. And that made me think of something else and how tying things together with Antoine Béchamp and how, his name and his legacy is, tragically ironic in a couple of ways. Because not only was he famous for the terrain theory, right? He's the first to synthesize this organic arsenical drug, arsenalic acid, right? Which later becomes the inspiration and first step towards chemotherapy. And so I think it's highly ironic that a man who prized healing of the body so much, it was his discovery that went on to create chemotherapy, which is so deadly and toxic to so many people with cancer. It's just unbelievable, the irony there. But not only that, it gets crazier with him because this arsenalic acid, which goes on to jumpstart chemotherapy, was also a compound that was used as veterinary feed to promote growth and prevent or treat dysentery in poultry and swine. So this compound that he's the first to isolate, which goes into this feed, helps plump up the chicken that they've been feeding and the swine and perhaps is the very toxin that creates the viral response in these animals that was first noticed in the 1930s. Unbelievable there. The irony, right? That is absolutely crazy. But while looking, it gets even nuttier that by looking further and doing the due diligence, I read about the pleomorphism, all right? And this really goes into the rivalry between him and Pasteur and what pleomorphism is versus, what the monomorphic theory was. And pleomorphism, as put forth by Béchamp and others, like Royal Raymond Rife, and people may know that name, and if you don't, you should, right? Look him up, right? They had the polymorphism, right? But the monomorphic theory was supported by Pasteur and others. Right? And it was this theory that won out and went on to really jumpstart the pharmaceutical industry as we know it today. All right. But who was among them? This Robert Koch, which of course could be read as cock, right? Which is a rooster, Which is unbelievable. Tying again to this, microbiology, invisible enemy, germ theory kind of thing. Right? How many people named after chickens have to be associated with this thing? I don't know. So it's just unbelievable the types of connections that could be made when you start looking at things and questioning elements of the story. Right? So I thought that was really unbelievable. And so I'm going to wrap this one up with a little cherry from Google Earth because while I was bringing up the Delmarva Peninsula, I happened to notice that it kind of looked like a rooster's wattle, which is that fleshy bit underneath its beak. The comb is on top, right? And that you can actually kind of get a roostery neck appearance out of this sort of mid-Atlantic going up into the Northeast corridor, with your pareidolia. This could be the comb, crown up here, a little beak action. But that's really more of a stretch. There was a greater pareidolic thing that I found looking in and closing in on, especially that this territory was so hotly disputed and was under control by the Calverts for so long. And going back to my idea of the Calverts being worm knights and so forth, when I look at this tract of land and some of the pareidolia that can be drawn out, not only can I see like screaming faces here, but what I saw was this sort of giant monster, this beetly thing that can be kind of like a worm creature underneath the Delmarva Peninsula if I want it. Look at this head here with this mouth. We got legs coming off. We got a tail. This could be some sort of weird underground monster living off the Delmarva Peninsula. It's just unbelievable, the pareidolia and the fun that can be made. And so, remember, just because you don't know the truth, it doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lie. Right? And so, until the next one, cheers, guys.